State your rank. The room went quiet enough to hear ice settling in a glass 3 tables away. He said it like a joke, like she was the punchline. The woman in the plain uniform standing alone near the wrong bar. The one he'd already decided didn't belong in a room full of decorated warriors. She gave him 2 words instead. A call sign. Nothing more. 4 generals shot out of their chairs. Not slowly. Not politely. Hands snapped to their brows in salute so fast. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Bows frozen in the air. 300 champagne glasses paused halfway to 300 open mouths. He turned around to see who they were, saluting. It was her. For 25 years, her father carried a secret that wasn't even his to carry. Tonight, one word was about to unravel a lie that cost a good man everything, and only she held the truth strong enough to bring it all crashing down. Colonel's Point Naval Amphibious Base did not usually host civilians. Tonight it did. Tonight the mess hall had been stripped of its long tables and dressed up in white linen and blue bunting, and somewhere near the back a string quartet was murdering a version of the Navy hymn that nobody in the room had asked for. Rank insignia everywhere. Ribbons stacked 4 deep on some of the older men's chests. And champagne, real champagne, not the sparkling cider they usually served at these things, because tonight the Amphibious Readiness Group was celebrating something. A joint commendation ceremony. Cross branch. The kind of night where careers got made in 5 minutes of small talk, with the right person standing near the right bar. Harper Kessler stood near the wrong bar. On purpose. She wore her service uniform correctly. Buttons aligned. Insignia squared away. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing that would draw a second look from anyone who didn't know how to read a uniform the way some people read a face. Which was the point. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to disappear in a room full of officers was to look exactly like what they expected, and nothing more. She sipped water. Not champagne. Never champagne on a night like this. Across the room, laughter. Big and easy and a little too loud, the kind that came from a man who had already had 2 drinks and was working on his confidence for a 3rd. Chief Petty Officer Dean Halstead. SEAL. Recently decorated, his name had been read out. 20 minutes ago, some valor commendation from an operation Harper hadn't been briefed on, and didn't need to be. He had the build for it. 6'2". Shoulders like a door frame, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved for recruitment posters. And the swagger. That was the part that made her jaw tighten a little every time he opened his mouth. He was working the room. Working it the way certain men worked rooms, like it existed for him. Like every conversation was a stage, and he was the only one who'd read the script. He'd made his way to the edge of a knot of junior officers, all of them laughing a beat too fast at whatever he was saying, and then his eyes drifted, landed on her. Harper felt it, before she saw it, that specific weight. A man deciding you were worth his attention, because you looked like you might be worth his contempt. He crossed the room. Easy stride. Practiced. Well, he said, stopping a few feet from her, drink in hand, smile already loaded. Didn't figure anyone actually reads name tags at these things. She didn't answer right away. Let the silence sit there. Watched him decide what to do with it. Kessler, he said, reading it off her chest like he'd won something. That a family name, or did they just assign it to you? Family name. Huh. He rocked back on his heels. Looked her up and down, not unkindly, but not with any particular respect, either, the way you might size up a new intern on their first day, trying to decide whether they'd survive the week. You liaison? Admin? You've got that look. What look? The look like you got lost on your way to a briefing and ended up staying for the free food. A couple of the junior officers near him laughed. Not loud, just enough. Harper set her water down on the bar behind her. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of motion that, if you knew what to look for, told you a person was buying themselves half a second to decide exactly how they wanted to handle what came next. I get invited, she said. Sure you do. He grinned wider, turned half toward his little audience playing to them now, warming up. Look, no offense. I've just never seen you around the group. And I know everybody around the group. He set his own glass down, mock formal now, drawing it out for the room. So go on. Humor me. Humor you with what? State your rank. The quartet kept playing behind them. Somewhere a glass clinked. Somewhere else, laughter unconnected, ordinary. The sound of 100 other conversations that had no idea what was about to happen 4 feet away. Harper looked at him for a second longer than was comfortable, because she'd heard this exact tone before, from other men, in other rooms. The tone that assumed the silence in a woman was empty space instead of something waiting to be filled, which was usually the moment she let them keep talking. Let them dig. Let the hole get deep enough that climbing out of it later would cost them something. Except tonight, there wasn't time for the long version. Tonight, 3 hours ago, she'd gotten a call that had rewritten the shape of this entire evening, and she had exactly one more obligation to get through before she could leave this room and go deal with it. So she gave him the short version instead. "Lieutenant Commander," she said. Even. Flat. Not performing it at all, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. United States Navy. Halstead blinked, recalculated, then recovered, because men like him always recovered, always found a joke to climb back up on top of. "Lieutenant Commander," he repeated, nodding slow, like he was tasting the words for a lie in them. That's a real rank. That is. Good for you." He raised his glass slightly, mock salute, and one of the junior officers snorted into his drink. "Didn't realize the Navy handed those out for." "That's not the part you should be worried about," Harper said, something in her voice. Just a shift, small, the register dropping a half tone, but Halstead heard it. His grin faltered a fraction, the way a man's does right before he understands he's misjudged a situation and hasn't yet figured out how badly. "Excuse me? You asked for my rank." She held his eyes. "You didn't ask for my designation." The word landed differently than rank had. Designation. A word that didn't belong in cocktail conversation. A word that belonged in files with black bars across half the page. "You're what?" Behind Halstead, at the far end of the room, a cluster of senior officers had been standing near the head table for the last 20 minutes, deep in the kind of conversation that people didn't interrupt. 4 of them, 2-star, 3-star, 2 more at 3-star, one of them close enough to 4 that nobody in the room addressed him by anything but sir. The kind of concentrated rank that made junior officers walk the long way around to avoid getting pulled into small talk they weren't equipped for. Harper looked past Halstead's shoulder, toward that cluster of stars, and let her voice carry, not loud, not a shout, just clear, just pitched to travel exactly as far as it needed to. "Call sign," she said. "Valkyrie." For 1 full second, nothing happened. Then the 4-star's head came up, sharp, like a wire had been pulled taut somewhere behind his eyes. And then he was moving, standing, chair scraping back hard enough that the sound cut clean through the string quartet's murdered rendition of the Navy hymn, and the musicians actually stopped playing, bow lifting off strings mid-note, because something in that scrape of a 4-star general's chair told even civilian musicians that the room had just changed. The other 3 followed. Not slow, not polite, considered, "Oh, should we?" standing. All 4 of them came up out of their seats inside of 2 seconds, back straightening, hands rising to their brows in salute toward her and the entire mess hall. 300 people deep in champagne and small talk went quiet in overlapping waves, like someone had thrown a stone into a pond, and the silence was rippling outward from wherever Harper Kessler happened to be standing. Halstead turned around, slow, like his body already understood what was happening, and his brain was 3 seconds behind trying to catch up. He looked at the generals, standing, saluting, toward the woman he'd just accused of getting lost on her way to the buffet. He looked back at Harper. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Harper didn't look at him. She was already walking unhurried, unbothered, the exact same pace she'd have used to cross a parking lot toward the head table, where the 4-star was still standing, hand still at his brow, and around her the entire room folded into a silence so complete you could hear ice settling in someone's abandoned drink 3 tables away. She stopped in front of him, returned the salute. Crisp, automatic, a motion her body had performed 10,000 times in rooms, with no cameras and no linen tablecloths and no orchestra. Rooms where the only witnesses were men who'd signed their names away to secrecy. before they were old enough to legally drink the champagne currently going flat all around this one. "Commander," the general said, voice low, "not for the room, for her. We didn't know you'd be here tonight." "Neither did I, sir," Harper said, "until 3 hours ago." Something passed over his face, a flicker. Recognition, maybe. Or the specific dread of a man who understood exactly what kind of phone call rearranges a lieutenant commander's Tuesday night. "We'll talk after," he said. Quiet enough that only she and the 2 officers flanking him could hear it. "Not here." "Understood, sir." He held her eyes a second longer than protocol required. Then he sat. The other 3 followed. And slowly, awkwardly, the way a held breath releases in pieces, instead of all at once, the rest of the room exhaled too. Conversations restarting in fragments. The quartet fumbling their way back into the piece they'd abandoned mid-bar, glasses lifting again, though half the people holding them had no idea what they'd just watched. Harper didn't go back to the bar. She felt him before she heard him. Halstead, following at a distance that tried to look casual and failed completely. Boots a half step too fast, the swagger gone out of his walk entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like a man trying to catch up to a truth that had already left the station without him. "Hey," he said. Low, to her back. "Hey, Kessler, Commander." "Ma'am." She stopped, turned. Let him have exactly 3 seconds of her attention. "You didn't what?" she said. "I didn't know." "No," she agreed. "You didn't. Look, that was." He rubbed the back of his neck, and for the first time all night, the recruitment poster jaw looked less like confidence and more like a man who'd stepped in something and was trying to figure out how far it had tracked. That was out of line. I was out of line. I run my mouth when I've had a couple, and I chief. He stopped talking. "I've been called worse things by better men," Harper said, "for a lot longer than tonight. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger either. It was just a fact. Delivered the way she delivered most facts, flat, economical, no more weight on it than it needed. And somehow that was worse for him than if she'd yelled. She watched it land. Watched him understand that whatever he'd expected from this conversation, an argument, an opening to apologize his way back into her good graces, some door he could talk his way through, wasn't going to open tonight. "Valkyrie," he said, quieter now, testing the word like it might bite him. "That A, is that a call sign? For what unit?" "I've never heard." "Not supposed to have heard it," Harper said. "That's the point of a call sign, Chief." She left him standing there. Didn't look back to see his face. Didn't need to. She could feel the shape of it anyway, the specific vertigo of a man who has spent his whole career believing he understood the room he was standing in, only to discover, in the space of 90 seconds, that the room had an entire floor beneath it he'd never known was there. Outside, the night air off the water was sharp enough to cut through the wool of her dress uniform. Harper stood on the steps of the mess hall for a moment, breathing it in, letting the ringing quiet in her ears settle back down to something closer to normal. Because all of that, the general standing, the room going silent, Halstead's face collapsing in on itself, none of it was the part of tonight that scared her. The part that scared her was in her jacket pocket. A single folded page. Words on it that she'd read 3 times in the last 3 hours and still hadn't found a way to make smaller than they were. Her phone buzzed against her hip. A text. From the aide who'd handed her that folded page in the first place, back at the office, right before she'd had exactly enough time to change into dress uniform and make the ceremony she couldn't skip without raising questions she didn't want raised. "Cars out front. He wants you at the SIF by 2200. Bring the file." She looked back once through the glass doors at the mess hall, at Halstead, standing frozen near the bar where she'd left him, at the 4 stars still seated at the head table, deliberately not looking toward the door, deliberately giving her the exit without an audience. Then she went down the steps, and the car was waiting, exactly like the text had promised, and inside it, on the seat, was a second folder identical to the one in her pocket, in case she'd need to read it again on the way. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She'd had it memorized since the first read. Instead, she looked out the window at the base sliding past chain link, sodium lights, the black water beyond it, and let herself go back, just for a minute, to the last time a photograph like the one in that folder had rearranged her whole understanding of who her father actually was. She'd been 9, not old enough to understand what she was watching, old enough to remember every second of it anyway. The lake house didn't have a name. Not really. Everyone in the family just called it the cabin, the way you'd refer to a person you'd known your whole life, by a nickname that had long since stopped needing explanation. Michigan side, deep timber, 40 minutes from anything you could call a town. Her father had built the dock himself the summer before she was born, and he still went out most mornings to check the boards for rot, even though the whole structure had outlived 3 separate roofing jobs on the house behind it. Walton Kessler didn't talk about the Navy. Not to civilians, not to family, not really even to himself as far as Harper could tell. What he did instead was wake at 430, whether or not there was anywhere to be, and run 4 miles down the tree line before the sun cleared the ridge, and clean his hunting rifles on the back porch, with a precision that had nothing to do with hunting and everything to do with muscle memory that had never fully stood down. He taught her to shoot on that back porch, age 7. A pellet gun first, then a .22, then over her mother's quiet, permanent disapproval something heavier, when Harper turned 12 and had shown enough discipline with the smaller calibers that he apparently decided discipline was the only qualification that mattered. Breathe out, he told her, that first time with the .22. His hands adjusting her elbow, her cheek weld, small corrections that never felt like corrections because he made them sound like secrets. Not all the way. Half. Then hold it. The rifle doesn't care how much you want to hit the target. It only cares how still you are when you stop trying. That doesn't make sense, 9-year-old Harper had said. It will, he'd said. Someday it will make more sense than anything anybody ever teaches you in a classroom. He was right, eventually. But that wasn't the lesson she remembered most. The lesson she remembered most was the box. She'd found it by accident, the summer she was 9, rummaging through the crawl space under the cabin's second bedroom, looking for an old badminton set she was sure had been stored there. Instead, she found a metal case, olive drab, government stenciling half rubbed away, locked, and beside it, half buried under a moving blanket, a photograph that had slipped loose from whatever it had originally been filed inside. 2 young men. Fatigues. Somewhere hot, somewhere with sand instead of snow. The kind of light that only exists right before a desert sunset turns everything gold and merciless at the same time. Her father younger than she'd ever seen him, harder around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with age, with his arms slung around another man's shoulders. Both of them, grinning like the photograph, had caught them in the middle of a joke that had already been forgotten by everyone, except the 2 people in the frame. On the back, in pencil, 2 words: Cormac, undertow. She hadn't understood any of it. Not the case, not the photograph, not the word undertow written like it meant something. She'd carried the photograph up from the crawl space meaning to ask her father about it over dinner, the way a 9-year-old asks about anything strange she finds, expecting a story, expecting the kind of easy explanation her father gave for everything else in that house. Instead, he'd gone very still, taken the photograph out of her hands with a gentleness that somehow scared her more than anger would have. Looked at it for a long moment. "Where'd you find this?" he said. Not a question, a demand wearing the shape of one. Under the bed, in the crawl space. Is that you? Harper. He'd crouched down to her eye level, which he almost never did. Her father talk to her standing up, the way he talked to everyone. Like the world was a briefing, he was always 3 sentences into giving. But he'd crouched that night, put both hands on her shoulders. "This stays between us. You understand? You don't tell your mother. You don't tell your teachers. You don't ever tell anyone this photograph exists." "Why not?" "Because some things a person does," he said, "they don't get to talk about. Not because they're ashamed. Because talking about them puts other people in danger. People you've never met. People who are counting on the silence to stay alive. Who's that with you?" Her father's jaw had done something then. Tightened, then released, like he'd caught himself about to say a name out loud and swallowed it at the last second. Nobody, he said. Not anymore. He never explained it. Not that year, not the next, not for the better part of 2 decades after. The photograph disappeared back into whatever drawer or safe. He kept things like that in. And the metal case in the crawl space was gone the next time she checked. And life at the cabin went back to 430 runs and rifle cleaning. And a father who talked about everything except the 9 seconds of stillness on the back of that photograph that had clearly cost him something he never planned on paying twice. Harper grew up understanding 2 things about her father with total certainty, even without the details. First, whatever he'd done in the Navy, in whatever years those fatigues belonged to, it had marked him the way a brand marks skin permanently, and mostly invisibly, except in the specific moments the shirt slipped and you caught the edge of the scar. Second, whatever had happened to the man in that photograph, Cormac, it wasn't a story with a happy ending. Her father didn't grieve people who were merely gone. He grieved people who had been lost, in the specific way that implied someone had failed to hold on to them. She joined the Navy at 22 believing, with the particular arrogance of the young, that she would eventually earn her way into whatever room contained her father's real answers. That competence would be the key. That if she became good enough, better than good enough, someone, somewhere, would finally decide she'd earned the truth. It took 9 years. Selection that broke people twice her size. A program so compartmentalized that even its existence was denied to 98% of the officers who outranked her. A call sign that 4 generals apparently still remembered on sight. In a mess hall 300 miles from the nearest classified facility, at a party where she wasn't even supposed to be recognized. And still the truth about the man in that photograph had waited for a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday to finally come find her. The car slowed gates. A checkpoint that didn't officially exist on any base map, manned by 2 Marines who checked her credentials with a thoroughness that suggested they already knew exactly who was arriving and were following procedure anyway, because procedure didn't care about exceptions. Inside, the SIF was cold the way all SIFs were cold, climate control tuned for equipment, not people, so that everyone who worked inside them long enough eventually kept a spare jacket in a drawer somewhere. Rear Admiral Osric Marsh was already there when she arrived. 3 stars on his collar, silver hair cut close enough that it barely registered as hair at all, standing at the head of a conference table with a look on his face that Harper had seen exactly twice before in her career, both times right before someone she'd trained beside stopped coming to work. "Commander," he said. Sit she sat. The folder in her pocket felt heavier than the 6 sheets of paper it actually contained. "You've read the brief," Marsh said. "Not a question." "3 times, sir." "Then you understand what we're looking at." On the wall screen behind him, an image resolved out of grain and static surveillance footage, time-stamped, degraded by whatever chain of intercepts had brought it into this room. A man, late 50s, maybe older, hard to tell from the angle, broad through the shoulders in the particular way that suggested the muscle had been built decades ago and simply refused to fully surrender to age. He was crossing a street somewhere with concrete architecture that could have been a dozen different cities, moving with the specific economy of someone who had spent a career being taught how not to be noticed and had never fully unlearned it. The footage froze, enhanced. A face resolved out of the blur, cheekbones and jaw, and a set of eyes that Harper had seen exactly once before, in a photograph she wasn't supposed to have found, tucked under a moving blanket in a crawl space in Michigan 20 years ago. "His name," Marsh said, "is Elias Cormac." The room got very quiet. "He was declared dead 25 years ago," Marsh continued. "Killed in action during a classified operation your father commanded. Your father wrote the after-action report himself. Signed it." Every officer who reviewed that file for the next quarter-century had no reason to doubt a single word of it. "Sir, let me finish, Commander." Marsh's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 6 days ago, an asset in the field flagged a facial match against an archived database during an unrelated surveillance operation. We ran it 4 times before anyone believed the result enough to bring it upstairs. Cormac is alive. Cormac has apparently been alive this entire time. And Cormac, as far as we can currently determine, has spent the last 2.5 decades building relationships with exactly the kind of people your father's operation was designed to stop. Harper sat very still. Somewhere behind her ribs, something that had been quietly, carefully sealed shut. For 20 years came apart at a seam she hadn't known was still holding. "Does my father know?" she said. "Your father," Marsh said, "is the reason we called you in tonight instead of tomorrow morning." He nodded to the aide by the door, who pulled up a second image, not surveillance this time. A phone log. Time stamped over the last 6 weeks. Numbers that meant nothing to Harper except for one detail that made the floor of the room tilt very slightly under her feet. 3 of the calls had originated from a burner registered in the name of a shell company Harper's family had used exactly once before, 22 years ago, to buy the boat that still sat under a tarp behind the cabin's boathouse. "We believe," Marsh said, quiet now, careful, the voice of a man delivering news he'd rehearsed the wording for, "that your father has known Cormac was alive for some time. We believe he may have been in contact with him, and we need you to find out why before anyone above my pay grade decides that a retired Master Chief with your father's clearance history and your father's daughter currently on this program constitutes a security problem that needs to be handled instead of understood." Harper looked at the frozen frame on the screen, at the face of a man who had died before she was old enough to know his name and who had apparently never died at all. "I need to see him," she said. "My father. Tonight." "That," Marsh said, "was already arranged before you walked in this room." The drive out to the cabin took 2 hours and 11 minutes, and Harper spent almost none of it thinking about the road. She thought about the photograph, about this stays between us, about a father who had spent her entire childhood teaching her that stillness was the only thing that mattered. Hold your breath. Don't move. Let the moment decide itself instead of forcing it, and who had apparently, somewhere along the way, applied that same doctrine to a truth he'd been sitting on for 25 years. The porch light was on when she pulled up the gravel drive, which meant he'd been told she was coming, which meant someone in that SIF had made a phone call the second she'd walked out the door, and her father had known this conversation was arriving. For however many hours it had taken her to drive here, and he'd turned the porch light on anyway, like it was any other night. Like she was coming home instead of coming to interrogate him. He was sitting on the top step when she got out of the car. 61 years old, still built like a man who ran 4 miles before sunrise out of pure stubbornness. A mug of coffee going cold in his hands despite the hour. "Heard you had an interesting night," he said before she'd even reached the bottom step. "Dad. Halstead," he said. "Word travels. Even out here." A ghost of something that might have been pride flickered across his face and disappeared just as fast, replaced by something heavier. "Wish I could say I was surprised it happened. Wish I could say a lot of things right about now." Harper stopped at the base of the steps. Didn't sit. Didn't want to sit. Not yet. Not until she understood whether the man in front of her was still the man she thought she'd grown up with. "Cormac," she said. Her father's hand went still around the mug. "Sit down, Harper." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me why there's a phone log with your name attached to a shell company that hasn't been used in 22 years, calling a burner phone that traces back to a man you told a Naval Review Board died under your command." For a long moment, her father said nothing, just looked out at the dark tree line the way he'd looked at it every morning for as long as she could remember. Like the woods held an answer he was still waiting to be handed. 25 years ago, he said finally, "I made a call in the field that I have spent every single day since trying to convince myself was the right one." His voice was low, steady, the same voice that had taught her to breathe out halfway and hold it. "Elias Cormac was my best friend before he was my responsibility. And when the operation went sideways, I had 11 seconds to decide whether to pull our extraction early and save the 4 men who were still alive, or hold position long enough to try and reach the one man who was already down." He set the mug on the step beside him, both hands empty now, resting on his knees like a man bracing for weight. "I chose the 4. You told everyone he was dead. I told everyone what I believed to be true, her father said. For 23 years, I believed it. Until 3 months ago, when I got a letter with no return address, and inside it was a photograph only 2 people in the world have ever seen, me and him. You didn't report it? No, Dad, I didn't report it, he said again, sharper now, the first real edge she'd heard in his voice all night. Because the first thing that happens the moment I report it is that this entire family becomes a target for whatever Cormac has spent 25 years turning himself into. And because. He stopped, swallowed, started again, quieter, because some small, stupid 25-year-old part of me needed to know first whether the man who wrote to me was still my friend, or whether he was already something else entirely. Which is it? Her father looked up at her then. And in the porch light, for just a moment, Harper saw something in his face she had never once seen there in 28 years. Not on the back porch with the rifles, not at her commissioning, not at any of it. Fear. I don't know, he said. That's the truth, Harper. I genuinely do not know. And that terrifies me more than anything that happened 25 years ago ever did. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Somewhere in the tree line, an owl called once and went silent. They're putting together a team, Harper said finally. To find him. Marsh wants me to lead it. Her father's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, something in them had settled, not resolved, not at peace, but decided, the way a man's face settles once he's finally stopped arguing with a fact he can't change. Then you're going to need people who know how to hold still, he said, and at least one who knows how to move fast enough to matter when holding still stops being enough. You have someone in mind. Roan Vance, her father said, if he'll still take my calls after all this. And whoever the program's given you for the technical side. Because Cormac was never going to be caught by the same tools that missed him for 25 years. Harper, you're going to need someone who can see him coming through channels men my age don't even know exist. Harper thought of Halstead, still frozen near that bar in her memory. And of the 2 names on a personnel file Marsh had slid across the SIF table before she'd left, and of the particular, specific weight of building a team out of people who had never once had to trust her before tonight. I need you to tell me everything, she said. Not the version in the after-action report. Everything, her father nodded once. Picked his coffee back up, gone cold now, and drank it anyway. Sit down, he said again. This is going to take a while. She sat. 3 days later, in a briefing room with blackout windows and a coffee machine that had clearly been chosen for reliability over quality, Harper stood at the head of a table, facing the 3 people her command had assembled and one she'd insisted on herself. Master Chief Roan Vance sat closest to the door. Out of habit more than assignment 29 years in, the kind of man who still automatically positioned himself for the fastest exit in any room he entered, a reflex his body had never bothered unlearning even in retirement. Silver at the temples, hands scarred in a dozen small places that told their own stories. He had the stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. Ensign Priya Malik sat at the opposite end, laptop already open. 3 monitors worth of information, somehow compressed onto its single screen. Fingers moving across the keys in the particular rhythm of someone who thought faster than most people could follow. 26 years old. Signals and cyber background, recruited out of a program that valued her instincts with satellite geometry more than her patience for chain of command. And Halstead, sitting exactly where she'd told him to sit, posture careful in the specific way of a man determined not to make the same mistake twice, saying nothing unless spoken to first. Vance broke the silence first, looking Halstead up and down with the unhurried assessment of a man who had trained 100 versions of him. So you're the one who called a program commander a secretary, he said. Halstead's jaw tightened. It won't happen again, Master Chief. Damn right it won't. Vance's mouth twitched, almost a smile, gone before it fully arrived. First rule I ever learned in this line of work, son. The quiet ones in the corner of the room are usually the ones who could kill you fastest. Learned that lesson cheap tonight. Some men learn it standing over a body. Copy that. Malik didn't look up from her screen. If we're doing introductions, she said, I've already pulled Cormac's known associate network back 4 layers. I can have a working geofence on his last 3 confirmed sightings by end of day if someone tells IT to stop flagging my search patterns as a security incident. That would be me, Harper said. I'll handle it. Appreciated. A ghost of a smile. Also, I looked up Valkyrie. The Norse thing. Choosers of the slain. That's kind of intense for a call sign, no offense. None taken. Vance leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest, eyes settling on Harper with the particular weight of a man who had known her father for longer than she'd been alive. Your dad trained me on maritime interdiction, back when dinosaurs still walked the coastline, he said. Best instructor I ever had. Also the most stubborn son of a bitch I ever served with, present company included. A beat, you favor him more than you probably want to hear. I've heard worse comparisons. You will, Vance said. Before this is over, I expect you'll hear a few things about your father you don't want to hear at all. He said it without cruelty. Just fact, laid flat on the table between them, the same way he'd probably laid 100 hard facts in front of 100 younger operators over 3 decades of service. Cormac's not the only thing we're hunting, Commander. We're hunting the truth about what actually happened 25 years ago. Those aren't always the same target. Harper held his gaze. Didn't flinch from it. Then we hunt both, she said. Because I already have half the truth. And half a truth is worse than none at all. It just tells you enough to bleed on. Malik's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. Halstead sat up a little straighter. And Vance, after a moment, nodded slow, deliberate, the nod of an old soldier deciding, finally, that the daughter standing in front of him might actually be built out of the same iron as the father he remembered. All right, Commander, he said. Where do we start? Harper reached into the folder in front of her, the same folder, edges soft now, from 3 days of being opened and closed, and opened again, and slid the surveillance photograph of Elias Cormac into the center of the table, where all 4 of them could see it. We start, she said, 25 years too late. So we make up the time. Outside the blackout windows, the base was already deep into the ordinary business of another evening mess hall's closing, watch changes rotating, 300 sailors going about lives that had no idea a woman 2 buildings over was about to spend the next several weeks hunting a ghost her own father had helped create. Harper Kessler looked around the table at the 3 people who would either keep her alive or fail to, and felt something settle into place behind her ribs that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with the 11 seconds her father had spent 25 years ago choosing 4 lives over 1. She intended to make sure nobody ever had to make that choice again. Not on her watch. Not while Valkyrie still answered to her name. The briefing room smelled like old coffee and dry erase marker by the 2nd week, which was probably appropriate, because everything about the last 14 days had smelled like something worn down to its last, useful version of itself. The coffee, the patience, the 4 of them circling the same table at 6 in the morning like it owed them an answer it kept refusing to give. Vance had the topography maps spread across one end, old school. Paper, not screen, because he'd said on day 1 that paper didn't crash, and paper didn't get hacked, and paper had never once, in 29 years, lied to him about elevation. Malik had the other end. 3 monitors worth of satellite geometry folded into one laptop screen. Motion tracking overlays stacked on top of a coastline that Cormac's last 3 confirmed movements traced like a slow, deliberate signature. And in the middle, where the 2 ends of the table were supposed to meet, and mostly didn't, Harper stood with a coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes, looking at both of their versions of the same truth, and thinking that somewhere in the gap between paper and pixels was probably exactly where Elias Cormac had been hiding his whole life. He's not staying in one place longer than 6 hours, Malik said, not looking up, which means either he's paranoid,
or he's smart, or
somebody's telling him where the net is before we cast it, Vance said. Silence. The specific kind that lands heavy in a room because everyone's already thought the thing out loud, and nobody wanted to be the first to say it in a briefing with a recorder running. You're saying we have a leak, Harper said. I'm saying 25 years ago I watched good men die. Because somebody 2 ranks above them decided the mission mattered more than the truth. Vance's jaw worked once, tight. So yeah, I'm saying it. Until somebody proves me wrong, I'm saying it. Malik's fingers stopped over the keys. That's a hell of an accusation for a Tuesday. Every good accusation starts on a Tuesday, Vance said. Nobody expects it on a Tuesday. Halstead, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed, snorted. Is that a saying, or did you just make that up? Made it up. Sounded true, though, didn't it? Kind of. Then it's a saying now. Vance tapped the map, dead center, a stretch of coastline 40 miles north of the last confirmed sighting. Here, if he's running a 6-hour clock, this is the only stretch of shoreline that fits the terrain profile cover on the approach. Water access for a fast exit. No population density to worry about witnesses. This is where I'd go. If I were him. If I were 25 years younger and still stupid enough to think I could outrun what I'd done. Harper studied the map. Studied the elevation lines Vance had circled in red pencil. The same way she'd studied 1,000 other maps in 1,000 other rooms. Except this one had her father's ghost sitting in every contour line. Because this was the kind of terrain he would have picked too. Because he'd taught Cormac. Because whatever the two of them had once been to each other, brothers, partners, the closest thing to family that men in that line of work were allowed to have some of it had clearly rubbed off both directions. Recon first, she said. Not extraction. Not yet. I want eyes on that stretch before we commit anyone. Copy that, Vance said. I can get a drone pattern up by 0400, Malik offered. Low altitude. Thermal masked. He won't see it coming. He'll see it coming, Vance said. Flat. Certain. Man spent 25 years assuming everyone's hunting him. You don't survive that long underground by trusting a quiet sky. Malik's mouth tightened. The tech's better than you think, Master Chief. The tech's always better than I think. Right up until it isn't. He didn't say it unkindly. Just tired. The specific tired of a man who'd buried people because somebody's tech had been better than they thought, right up until the exact moment it mattered most. We do this the old way. Boots on the ridgeline, eyes that don't need a satellite uplink to keep working when the power goes out. The power doesn't go out, Malik said. That's not how any of this works anymore. Everything goes out eventually. Vance looked at her. Not unkind either. Something almost gentle underneath the gravel of his voice. That's the lesson, kid. Not the tech. The lesson is that everything you build a plan around can fail. So you build the plan around the thing that can't. Which is what? You. Which is people who know how to hold still and wait. A small, tired smile. There's no version of a chip that does that. Harper let the argument breathe for exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second longer. Both, she said. Drone for the wide picture. Boots for the ground truth. I'm not betting this on either one of you being completely right, because knowing this family, you're both about to be half right at exactly the wrong moment. Vance huffed something that was almost a laugh. She does favor him. I heard that the first time, Harper said. Wasn't trying to hide it the second time. Halstead pushed off the wall, crossing toward the table, close enough now that Harper could feel the specific gravity he carried into every room. Not arrogance anymore, not since the mess hall, but something adjacent to it that hadn't fully burned off. Confidence with the edges sanded down. Still confidence, though. So what's my job, he said. Since apparently I'm the only one in this room who hasn't earned a nickname yet. You'll earn one, Vance said. Usually happens right after you do something either very brave or very stupid. Sometimes both. Comforting. Wasn't meant to be. Harper looked at Halstead for a moment, weighing something, because on paper he was exactly what the team needed. CQB experience, close protection training, a body built for the specific violence of getting people out of bad situations fast and off paper. He was still the man who'd said state your rank in a room full of witnesses, and some small, unprofessional corner of her still enjoyed watching him work to earn back the ground he'd given away in 90 seconds. You're on me, she said. Close support. If this goes loud, you're the one making sure I'm still standing when it's over. Copy that. A beat. Then quieter, almost careful, for what it's worth. I've been trying to figure out how to say this properly for 2 weeks, and every version sounds worse out loud than it does in my head, so I'm just going to say it badly. I'm sorry. For all of it. The mess hall. I know you know. I'm still saying it. Noted. She almost let it end there. Almost. Except something in his face, earnest in a way that didn't fit the man who'd swaggered across that room 2 weeks ago, made her add one more line. Quiet enough that it stayed between just the two of them. You want to actually make it up to me, Chief. You keep your eyes open out there. That's the only apology that means anything in this line of work. Copy that too. Which was, Harper thought, probably the first completely honest exchange the two of them had ever had. The recon went out at 04:30, 3 days later, under a sky heavy with the kind of low cloud cover that's swallowed moonlight whole. Harper took point with Halstead 6 meters behind her, Vance running the overwatch position from a ridge a click out, Malik back at the command post with 3 screens glowing in an otherwise dark room, feeding real-time terrain data into their earpieces in a voice that stayed steady even when the numbers she was reading weren't. The shoreline Vance had circled in red pencil turned out to be exactly what the map promised. Rock outcroppings for cover. A narrow beach access half hidden by scrub pine. A single structure, a boathouse, weathered, half collapsed on one corner, sitting close enough to the water that a fast boat could be in open ocean inside of 90 seconds from the door. Structures occupied, Harper murmured into her mic, eyes fixed on the thin line of light bleeding out from under the boathouse door. 1 heat source, maybe 2. Copy, Malik's voice, tinny and close. Thermals picking up the same. Hold position. I'm cross-referencing against the last confirmed. She stopped. The silence on the other end of the channel lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. Malik. Something's wrong. Her voice had changed. Sharper. Faster. The signal pattern, this location's been pinged 3 times in the last 6 hours by an outside query, not us. Somebody else has been watching this exact stretch of coastline, recently. Like within the hour, recently. Harper's stomach dropped a half inch, the specific vertigo of a plan you'd trusted suddenly, showing you the crack running straight through its center. Somebody beat us here. I'm saying somebody told somebody we were coming. Because that was the only explanation that fit. Because Vance had said it 2 weeks ago in a briefing room over cold coffee, and everyone had let it sit there half believed, half hoped away, and now here it was, standing in front of them, dressed up as an empty boathouse with a light on inside it that felt less like a target and more like an invitation. Fall back, Harper said, already moving. Everybody fall back. This is. The boathouse door blew outward, not an explosion exactly. Controlled. A breach charge. Professional. The kind of thing that told her whoever was on the other side of that door had known exactly what shape of trap they were building and exactly when to spring it. Muzzle flash lit the tree line half a second later. 3 positions she hadn't accounted for, opening up from angles that made no tactical sense, unless the shooters had already known precisely where she and Halstead would be standing when the shooting started. Contact left! Halstead's voice, sharp, already moving her behind the nearest rock outcropping, with a hand on her shoulder. That was rougher than protocol, and exactly right for the moment. 3 shooters, maybe 4. They had this dialed in before we ever set foot on that beach. I know. This wasn't bad luck, Commander. This was a setup, I know, Chief. Focus on staying alive and be angry about it later. Rounds cracked off the rock face inches from her head. Close enough that stone dust stung the side of her jaw. Somewhere above them, on the ridge, Vance's voice cut through the chaos, calm in the way that only came from a man who'd been in exactly this kind of moment more times than he could count anymore. I've got an angle on 2 of them. Give me your position, Commander. I'll walk you a lane. Copy? Except the rock outcropping they were pinned behind gave them maybe 4 feet of clean cover and a field of fire that ran straight through the one gap in the tree line that put both her and Halstead in the open for the exact 3 seconds it would take to move. She could see it. Could see the whole geometry of the problem laid out like a puzzle with only one working solution, and the solution required somebody taking a shot that had no business landing. Vance, she said. Talk to me about the shooter on the boathouse roofline. Second story, northeast corner. I see him. 400 meters, maybe 420. Winds coming off the water. Crossing left to right. I'd put it 8, maybe 10 knots. Can you make it? A pause. Not long. Just long enough for Harper to understand that Vance already knew the honest answer and was deciding whether to give it to her. At this range, in this wind, with this rifle, no. Not a clean hit. Not one I'd bet a life on. Then I need to. Commander, get me eyes on him. I'll take the shot myself. You're pinned. You don't have an angle, I'll make one. Because she'd trained for exactly this. Because somewhere in 9 years of selection, and a father who'd spent her childhood teaching her that stillness mattered more than desire, this exact scenario had been built into her hands so many times it barely required conscious thought anymore. Except it did require it. It required every ounce of it. Because this wasn't a range, and this wasn't a drill, and if she got the geometry wrong by even a half degree, Halstead was the one standing in the open when the next round came through. She moved. 3 feet along the base of the outcropping, low, fast, drawing exactly the kind of attention that made Halstead swear behind her, and lay down covering fire in a burst that bought her the half-second she needed. The angle opened. 420 meters, roughly. Wind crossing left to right at somewhere around 9 knots if Vance's red was close, which it usually was. A target silhouette barely visible against the dark tree line behind the boathouse roof, moving, adjusting his own firing position, giving her a window that would close the second he settled again. Harper breathed out. Not all the way. Half. The rifle doesn't care how much you want to hit the target. It only cares how still you are when you stop trying. Her father's voice. 21 years old in her memory, and exactly as clear as if he were standing behind her right now. Hands on her elbow, adjusting. She held. The world went very quiet in the specific way it always did in the half-second before a shot that mattered, the gunfire around her, still happening, still loud, still real, but somehow distant, filtered down to background noise, while the only thing that existed was the reticle and the wind and the 420 meters of empty air her bullet was about to cross. She fired. The shooter on the boathouse roofline dropped. Not wounded, not stumbling for cover. Dropped. The specific finality of a shot that had answered every variable correctly. And for 1 full second, the gunfire around them actually stuttered, the remaining shooters recalibrating against a threat they hadn't accounted for, and in that stutter Halstead was moving, dragging her back behind full cover, breathing hard, staring at her like he'd just watched something he didn't have a framework for. He shook his head. That was a 400-meter crosswind shot from a pinned position with maybe 1.5 seconds of exposure. That's not a shot. I don't even have a word for what that was. Focus, Harper said, though something in her chest was still ringing, adrenaline and the specific hollow calm that always followed a shot like that. The same hollow calm her father's face used to carry on the mornings after he'd cleaned his rifles longer than usual. We're not out of this yet. Copy that. Vance. She keyed her mic. 2 shooters left, they're falling back toward the water. Nothing. Vance, come in. Static. Not the clean static of a channel switch. The specific static of a radio that had taken damage, or a hand that had stopped keying the mic on purpose. Or Malik. Do you have eyes on Vance's position? A pause that lasted a lifetime. Malik's voice cracked, just slightly. Just enough for Harper to hear the 18-year-old underneath the ensign for 1 unguarded half-second. He's down. He's moving, but he's down, thermals showing. I'm going to him. Commander, the remaining shooters are still. I don't care. She was already moving, already scrambling up the ridgeline with Halstead half a step behind her, every part of her training screaming that this was exactly the wrong call, and every part of her that had grown up on that back porch with a man teaching her that some things a person doesn't get to talk about, screaming louder that Vance did not get to become one more silence she carried for the rest of her life. She found him 30 meters from his overwatch position. The ground around him dark and wrong in the way. Ground gets wrong. One hand pressed against his side, rifle still gripped in the other, because some habits didn't let go even when everything else did. "Hey," he said, voice thin, trying badly for the same dry tone he'd used at the briefing table 2 weeks ago. "Told you, everything fails eventually. Don't." Harper dropped to her knees beside him, hands already moving. Pressure, the specific frantic competence of someone who'd been trained for exactly this and had never once wanted to use it. "Don't you dare make jokes right now. Somebody's gotta." His eyes found hers, and underneath the pain there was something steady there. Something that had already made peace with a version of tonight she wasn't ready to make peace with. "Listen to me. 2 shooters, southeast. They'll be on the water in under a minute if somebody doesn't. Halstead's got it." "Good." A breath, wet, effortful. "Good girl. Vance your father," he said, and something in the way he said it made Harper's whole body go still, colder than the night around them. 25 years ago, everybody always assumed it was his call. The extraction. Leaving Cormac. His hand found her wrist, weak but deliberate, like this was the last piece of cargo he intended to deliver whether his body cooperated or not. It wasn't. It was never his call to make. He was a lieutenant, Harper. Lieutenants don't order extractions. Somebody above him did. Somebody who spent 25 years letting your father carry the weight of a decision he never actually made. Who? Vance's eyes were losing focus now. The specific slow fade Harper had seen exactly twice before in her career and had hoped never to see again. "Ask your father," he said. "Ask him who signed the extraction order. Ask him whose name is actually on it." His grip tightened. One last time, fierce. "Don't let them bury this the way they buried Cormac. You hear me? Don't you let them?" "I hear you."
"Good."
His hand went slack. "Good girl." Gunfire cracked somewhere below them. Halstead's, sharp and controlled. And then silence. And then his voice over the radio, breathless, confirming the last 2 shooters down, the boathouse secure, extraction inbound. Harper stayed on her knees in the dark beside Roan Vance for exactly as long as protocol allowed her to and not 1 second longer. Because there would be time to grieve properly later. In a room with no witnesses, the way her father had taught her, without ever meaning to teach her anything at all. The debrief happened in a room with too much fluorescent light and not enough air. Marsh sat at the head of the table, 3 stars catching the light every time he shifted, his face doing the particular arithmetic of a commander who has to weigh a dead operator against a mission that isn't finished yet. Malik sat across from Harper, eyes red-rimmed, laptop closed for the first time in 2 weeks because there was nothing left to pull up that would make any of it easier. Halstead stood near the door, still in his field gear, blood not his dried dark along one forearm. "Master Chief Vance," Marsh said, "gave 30 years to this Navy. He'll be remembered accordingly." "He'll be remembered as the reason the rest of us are sitting in this room," Harper said. Flat, not disrespectful, just true. "Somebody knew we were coming, Admiral. Somebody fed our position to Cormac's people before we ever left the base." Marsh's jaw tightened. "We're investigating that." "Investigate faster." "Commander, with respect, sir, I buried a friend on a beach 2 hours ago because somebody in a secure facility decided our operation was worth selling." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Some things landed harder flat. "I'd like to know why before I lose anyone else." Marsh held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed behind his eyes, not defensiveness exactly. Something closer to a man recalculating how much longer a particular silence could hold. "You'll have your answer," he said finally. "I give you my word." It wasn't enough. It was, Harper understood, all she was going to get tonight. She found her father on the porch again 3 hours later. The drive out to the cabin, blurred by exhaustion and grief in equal measure. Headlights cutting through fog that hadn't been there the last time she'd made this drive. He was waiting. Standing this time, not sitting, like some part of him had already known from her voice on the phone, maybe, or from 28 years of reading his daughter's silences, the way she'd learned to read a wind flag, that tonight wasn't going to be a conversation he could take sitting down. "Vance," he said. "Not a question, he's gone." Her father's face didn't crumple. It did something worse, it went very still. The specific stillness of a man absorbing a blow he'd been half expecting his whole life, and had never once found a way to prepare for anyway. "He saved my team," Harper said. Last thing he did before he died was tell me to ask you a question. What question? Who signed the extraction order? 25 years ago. She held her father's eyes, steady, unwilling to let this be gentle, even though every part of her wanted to give him that. Vance said it wasn't you. Said you were a lieutenant. Said lieutenants don't order extractions. For a long moment, her father said nothing at all. The fog moved through the tree line behind him. Slow, indifferent, the same fog that had probably rolled through this exact clearing every night for the last 25 years, while a man stood on this porch, carrying a weight that apparently had never belonged to him in the first place. No, he said finally, I didn't sign it. Then who did? Her father's hands, resting on the porch rail, tightened until his knuckles went pale. His name, he said, was Major Osric Marsh. Fog, silence. Somewhere far off, an owl calling into a night that had gotten very, very cold. He's a 3-star now, her father said. Which means somewhere in the last 25 years, the man who left Elias Cormack to die got promoted 3 separate times on the strength of a mission report that let everyone believe I was the one who made that call. His voice cracked, just slightly. 25 years of held silence, finally finding a crack wide enough to leak through. I let him. Harper, God help me, I let him, because reporting the truth would have destroyed both our careers, and half the men on that operation would have lost their pensions along with their commanding officer. And I told myself that was protecting people. He looked at her, and in the porch light his eyes were wet, in a way she had never once seen in 28 years. I don't know if it was protecting people anymore. I think it might have just been protecting him. Harper stood very still. Because Marsh. Because the man who'd stood up in that mess hall and saluted her like her career meant something to him. Because the man sitting at the head of every debrief table for the last 2 weeks, promising answers he was apparently never going to give. Because giving them would mean admitting he'd built 3 decades of rank on top of a decision that had gotten one man abandoned, and tonight gotten another man killed, trying to clean up the wreckage of it. He's the leak, she said. Quiet, certain, the pieces sliding into place with the cold, terrible clarity of a rifle scope finally finding its mark. Not somebody working for him. Him. He's been managing this from the inside the entire time. Her father didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough, the same silence he'd been keeping for 25 years. Finally cracked wide open on a foggy porch in Michigan, with his daughter standing in front of him, holding the weight he'd been carrying alone since before she was born. I have to go back, Harper said. I know. I have to finish this. Properly. Which means Marsh doesn't get to hide behind 3 stars and a promotion board for 1 more day. Her father reached out slow, careful, the way he used to adjust her elbow on that back porch a lifetime ago and put a hand on her shoulder. Then go finish it, he said. But Harper, when you find him, when you're standing in front of Osric Marsh with the truth finally in your hands. His grip tightened, just slightly, the same fierce grip Vance had used with his last conscious breath. Don't you let him talk his way out of it the way I let myself stay quiet. Some silences cost more than the truth ever would have. I know that now. I know it 25 years too late. Don't you make my mistake. Harper looked at her father, 61 years old. Finally unburdened of a secret that had cost him half a lifetime of peace, standing on a porch he'd built with his own hands, in a clearing that had kept this truth safe for longer than she'd been alive, and felt something settle into place behind her ribs that was harder and colder and far more certain than anything she'd carried into that boathouse 2 hours ago. I won't, she said. She got back in the car. The fog swallowed the porch light behind her within 100 yards. And somewhere out past the tree line, in a briefing room with too much fluorescent light, a 3-star admiral was about to discover that the daughter of the man he'd let carry his sins for 25 years had finally learned exactly whose name belonged on that extraction order. Malik was waiting when Harper walked back into the command post at 4 in the morning, laptop already open, 3 monitors glowing in the dark. You look like you haven't slept, Malik said. I haven't. You look like something else too. I know who the leak is. Malik's hands went still over the keyboard. Halstead, asleep in a chair in the corner, came awake instantly. The particular light sleep of a man who'd spent his career learning to hear danger before it finished announcing itself. "Tell me," Malik said. Harper pulled a chair up to the table, and in the cold blue light of 3 monitors, in a room that still smelled faintly of the coffee Vance had complained about 100 times over the last 2 weeks, she told them everything her father had finally said out loud. After 25 years of silence, the extraction order, the name on it, the 3 stars built on top of a lie that had gotten one man abandoned in the desert and, 2 hours ago, gotten another man killed on a beach 400 miles from home. When she finished, nobody spoke for a long moment. "Rear Admiral Marsh," Halstead said finally, slow, like the words needed testing before he could fully believe them. "The same Marsh who's been sitting at the head of every debrief table for 2 weeks. The same Marsh who told you, and I quote, 'You'll have your answer. I give you my word, the same one. So what do we do?'" Harper looked at the surveillance photograph still pinned to the corkboard behind Malik's monitors. Elias Cormack, frozen mid-stride on a street in a city that could have been anywhere. A man who had spent 25 years believing her father had left him to die, when the truth was that the man who'd actually made that call had spent 25 years letting everyone believe exactly that. "We finish it," she said. "All of it, Cormac Marsh. The truth, whatever it costs to drag it into the light." Her hand closed, slow, deliberate, around the edge of the table. "Because somebody is going to answer for what happened to Vance tonight. And it is not going to be the man who was never actually guilty in the first place." Outside, the fog was starting to lift off the water, the first gray edge of dawn finding its way through the blackout curtains. And somewhere out there on a coastline, in a city, in an office with 3 stars on the door, 2 men who had spent 25 years running from the same lie were about to discover that a woman with her father's steady hands and her father's unbearable patience had finally stopped being willing to let either of them keep hiding behind it. Rear Admiral Osric Marsh did not look like a guilty man when Harper walked into his office at 0600. 4 hours after leaving the command post, 4 hours after telling Malik and Halstead exactly what they were going to do about it. He looked like exactly what he always looked like. Composed, silver-haired. A man who had built 30 years of career out of looking like the room's steadiest hand. Right up until the moment somebody finally checked whether the hand had ever been steady at all. "Commander." He didn't look up from the file on his desk. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." "Sit, I'll stand." That got him to look up. Something in her voice, maybe. Or something in her face. The specific stillness she'd learned from a man who'd spent 25 years perfecting it on a porch in Michigan, waiting for exactly this morning to arrive. "I found the leak," Harper said. Marsh set his pen down. Careful, deliberate. The motion of a man buying himself half a second the same way she'd bought herself half a second in a mess hall 2 weeks ago, deciding exactly how he wanted to handle whatever came next. "Good," he said. "Who?" "You already know who." The room went very quiet. Outside, a base was waking up the way bases always woke up, engines turning over, boots on gravel, the ordinary machinery of a morning that had no idea it was about to become the last ordinary morning a 3-star admiral would ever have. "Careful, Commander." His voice hadn't changed. That was the thing Harper would remember later, how level it stayed. How practiced, like a man reciting lines he'd rehearsed for exactly this contingency for 25 years. That's a serious accusation to level at a superior officer with no evidence. "I have evidence." "Do you?" "Major Osric Marsh," Harper said, "signed the extraction order 25 years ago. Not my father. You. She let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. You left Elias Cormack to die in the field, and then you let a lieutenant carry that decision on his conscience for the next quarter-century, while you climbed 3 ranks on the strength of a lie he was too loyal to correct." Marsh's hands, resting flat on the desk, did not move, but something in his face did a small collapse, almost imperceptible, the specific give of a structure that had been holding weight far longer than it was built to. "Your father," he said quietly, "chose not to correct the record. That was his choice, not mine." His choice to protect you. His choice to protect everyone. Marsh snapped. And there it was, the first crack in 30 years of composure, sharp enough that Harper felt it land like a physical thing in the space between them. Do you understand what would have happened if that report had named me? An entire operations chain of command falls under review. Every officer who served under me loses their pension while a board decides whether the mission was even legal to begin with. I made a tactical call in 11 seconds with 4 men's lives on one side of the scale and 1 man's on the other. And I have carried that call every single day for 25 years, Commander. Whether or not you believe that, you didn't carry it, Harper said. My father carried it. You just kept the promotions, silence, the kind that has teeth. And Vance, Harper said, quieter now, each word laid down like a stone she intended to leave exactly where it landed. Master Chief Roan Vance bled out on a beach 2 nights ago because somebody fed our position to Cormac's people before we ever left this base. I want to know if that was you too. Something flickered behind Marsh's eyes. Fast. Gone almost before it arrived. But Harper had spent 9 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker in a man's face across 400 meters of open air, and she did not miss it now. I never wanted anyone else to die, he said, low, almost sincere. That's not an answer. Cormac contacted me, Marsh said, and the words came fast now, the specific rush of a man who has been holding a confession behind his teeth for so long, that once the dam gave, it gave completely. 6 months ago, a letter, no return address, same as the one he sent your father. He knew he'd always known that I signed that order, not Walton. He'd known for 25 years, Commander, sitting wherever he sat, nursing it. And he finally decided it was time somebody paid for it besides the 4 men I saved. So you fed him our position. I fed him delays, Marsh said, and for the first time his composure fully broke, both hands coming up off the desk, pressing flat against his own face for 1 raw second before dropping again. I thought, God help me, I thought if I slowed your team down enough, gave him enough warning to relocate before you found him, this could resolve itself without either of us ever having to answer for what happened 25 years ago. I never authorized an ambush. I never told him where your team would be standing. I swear to you, Commander, I never intended for anyone to die on that beach. Vance is dead. I know. Say his name. Marsh's jaw worked. Master Chief Vance is dead, he said, and his voice cracked clean through the middle of it, and I will carry that for the rest of my life, exactly the way your father has carried a decision that was never even his to carry. Harper looked at him for a long moment. At the 3 stars on his collar, each one representing a rank he'd climbed on the back of a silence that had cost her father 25 years of guilt he'd never earned, and had cost Roan Vance the last 30 seconds of his life, on a dark beach 400 miles from anyone who loved him. You're going to write it down, she said. Everything. The extraction order. The letter. What you told Cormac and when you told it to him. Every piece of it, in your own hand, and then you're going to hand it to the review board yourself, before I hand them the version I've already got from 3 independent sources. Commander, that's not a request, Admiral. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, something in Marsh's shoulders gave way, not surrender exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a man who had been holding a structure upright with his own bare hands for 25 years and had just been told, finally, that he was allowed to let it fall. Where is he? Harper said. Cormac. You've been in contact. You know where he's running to next. Marsh's eyes closed briefly. There's a facility, he said, north of the coordinates your team hit 2 nights ago. Old Coast Guard station, decommissioned 12 years back. Sitting on federal land nobody's bothered to repurpose. He told me he'd be there through the end of the week. Regrouping, deciding what to do about the fact that his own leverage over me just got significantly more complicated. You're going to write that down too. I will. Harper turned to leave, stopped at the door, hand on the frame, looking back at a man who 30 minutes ago had looked untouchable and now looked like exactly what he was, someone who had spent a quarter-century running from 11 seconds of decision, only to discover that the running had cost more than the decision ever would have. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think you're a monster, Admiral. I think you made a hard call under fire, and then spent 25 years too afraid to live with the consequences of it honestly. That's not evil. That's just weakness dressed up in 3 stars. She held his eyes. But weakness got a good man killed 2 nights ago. And that's the part you don't get to explain your way out of. She left him sitting there, pen finally moving across paper, writing down a truth that had waited 25 years to find its way onto the page. The old Coast Guard station sat on a spit of land where the coastline bent sharp enough to create its own weather fog that didn't burn off until noon most days. Wind that came at you from 3 directions depending on the tide. Harper studied it through field glasses from the tree line, Halstead beside her, Malik running overwatch from a position 200 meters back, with a rifle she'd insisted on learning to use properly over the last 2 weeks. Ever since the night on the beach had taught all 3 of them exactly how fast the theoretical could turn real. 2 heat signatures. Malik's voice, steady now, steadier than it had been the last time they'd done this. Main structure. No exterior patrol, which either means he's stopped worrying about being found, or he wants to be found, Harper said. Comforting thought. Wasn't meant to be. Halstead checked his weapon one more time, the motion automatic, unhurried. 2 weeks ago he'd have filled this silence with something a joke, a comment, some easy confidence meant to paper over whatever he was actually feeling. Now he just breathed, slow and even, the way Vance had taught him without ever quite meaning to teach him anything. You good? Harper asked. No, Halstead said, honest. But I'll be good enough. That's usually all any of us are. They moved at first light, the fog working in their favor for once, muffling sound and softening edges the way it had every morning for 12 years, while this station sat empty and waiting for exactly this kind of ending. The door wasn't locked. That detail sat wrong in Harper's chest the whole way across the threshold. An unlocked door on a man who'd survived 25 years underground by trusting nothing. And now here it was, standing open like an invitation she hadn't asked for. Elias Cormack was sitting in what had once been the station's radio room, in a chair, angled toward the door waiting. Older than the photograph. Grayer, but the same broad set of shoulders her father had once slung an arm around in a photograph taken in a desert that no longer existed the way it had that day. The same hard eyes that had apparently spent 25 years learning exactly how much a person could carry before it broke them. Harper Kessler, he said. Not a question. His voice was rougher than she'd imagined it, worn down by something that wasn't just age. You look like him. God help you. You knew I was coming. I knew somebody was coming eventually. A small, humorless smile. Didn't figure it'd be his daughter with a rifle instead of the man himself with an apology. Halstead shifted at the door, weapon low but ready, and Cormac's eyes flicked to him and back to Harper without any particular urgency. The specific calm of a man who had already made peace with however this ended. Marsh confessed, Harper said, in writing. Everything the extraction order, the letter he got from you, feeding our position 2 nights ago. It's already on its way to a review board. Something crossed Cormac's face. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than that. 25 years, he said. I built an entire life around one fact. That Walton Kessler left me to die. His hands resting on his knees curled slowly into fists. I told myself it 1,000 different ways. Told other people, worse versions of it. People who were happy to hear that a Navy officer had left his own man behind. People who paid well for that story, and better for what I could give them after it. A long breath, and the whole time, the whole entire time. It wasn't even true. No, Harper said, it wasn't. So who do I blame now? His voice cracked, raw in a way that had nothing to do with weakness, and everything to do with a 1/4 century of grief, finally finding a place to land and discovering the place was empty. 25 years of hating the wrong man. 25 years of becoming exactly the kind of person your father would have had every right to leave behind, except he never actually did it. And I built my whole life on a lie some coward with 3 stars told to save his own career. You could have asked, Harper said, not unkind. Just true. At some point in 25 years. You could have found a way to ask my father directly instead of building a life around an assumption. Could I? Cormac's laugh was bitter, short. You don't know what it's like, being declared dead. Watching your own funeral get held from 300 miles away, because somebody decided that was cleaner than the truth. There's no clean way back from that, Commander. There's no version of asking politely when the world has already buried you and moved on. There's a version where 2 nights ago, a good man doesn't die on a beach because you decided the only way through your grief was to become dangerous. That landed. Harper watched it land, watched something in Cormac's face fold under the weight of it, and for a moment the room held nothing but fog light through a cracked window and the particular silence of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a truth neither of them had asked to inherit. His name was Roan Vance, Harper said. He trained under my father. He came out of retirement for me, because my father asked him to, and because some debts don't have an expiration date. He held a ridgeline for us with a wound already opening in his side, and the last thing he did with his life was make sure I knew the truth about my father before he let himself go. Cormac's jaw tightened. I didn't order that ambush. I know. Marsh already told me his men acted without his direct order, feeding on information he'd handed them out of panic. Harper held his eyes. Doesn't change whose network they belong to. Doesn't change whose fingerprints are all over the last 25 years of exactly this kind of consequence. For a long moment, Cormac said nothing at all. What happens now? He said finally. Now you come in, Harper said. Not as a ghost. Not as a myth some review board buries under 3 more layers of classification. As a man who's going to answer for what he's done, and let the truth about what was done to him finally see daylight too. And if I don't? Halstead's weapon came up a half inch, almost involuntary. And Harper raised one hand without looking at him, a small certain motion that said not yet, not like this. Then I don't have a choice, she said. But I'd rather you make one instead of forcing me to. Cormac looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The way a man looks at a person he's trying to decide whether to trust with the last decision of a life he'd stopped believing in a long time ago. You have his eyes, he said quietly. Walton's. Same exact look he used to give me right before he made a call nobody else wanted to make. A breath, shaky, 25 years finally exhaling out of a man who'd been holding it since a desert sunset that no longer existed anywhere except in memory. All right, Commander. I'll come in. On one condition. What condition? I want to see him. Your father. Before any of this goes to a courtroom or a classified file, or wherever the truth ends up getting buried this time. His voice cracked, finally, all the way through. I spent 25 years hating a man who never stopped being my friend. I'd like the chance to say that to his face while I still have one that isn't behind a fence. Harper thought of the porch, of fog rolling through a tree line at 4 in the morning, of a father who had carried a stranger's guilt for a quarter century, because loyalty, real loyalty, apparently didn't come with an expiration date any more than debt did. I'll arrange it, she said. The cabin looked exactly the way it always looked. In early morning, light porch light, still burning out of habit more than necessity, dock stretching out toward water gone silver, with the last of the fog, the whole scene so ordinary that it felt almost cruel, the setting for the ending of 25 years of grief. Looking exactly like every other Tuesday morning that had come before it. Walton Kessler was waiting on the top step when the car pulled up. He'd known this morning was coming. Harper had called ahead, given him what warning she could, though no amount of warning fully prepares a man for the specific weight of watching a ghost climb out of a government vehicle and walk toward him across gravel. He'd raked 1,000 times without ever once expecting to see this particular pair of boots crossing it again. Elias Cormac stopped at the base of the steps. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. 2 old men weathered by 25 years that had bent them in entirely different directions, standing close enough to finally see what the other had become. Walt, Cormac said. Rough, uncertain. Elias. Her father's voice broke clean on the second syllable. 25 years of held grief, finally finding an exit it had been denied for a quarter century. God. Elias. I thought you left me, Cormac said. Simple, devastating. 25 years, Walt. I thought you looked at the four of them and looked at me and decided I was the one worth losing. I never made that call. Her father came down 2 steps, slow, careful, the specific care of a man approaching something he was terrified might not survive being touched. I have spent every single day since believing I made it, believing I chose them over you and telling myself I could live with that, because the alternative was admitting I'd let a coward hide behind my silence for 25 years while you paid for a decision that was never mine to make. Marsh. Marsh. Her father's hands, at his sides, curled slowly into fists and then released. The same motion Harper had watched Cormac make an hour earlier in a decommissioned radio room 40 miles up the coast. I should have named him the day I found out. I told myself I was protecting people. I think, in the end, I was mostly just protecting myself from what naming him would have cost me. Cormac's eyes were wet now, unashamed of it, 25 years of hardened silence, finally cracking all the way through, in the gray morning light of a lake house he'd probably imagined, visiting 1,000 different ways, over 1,000 different years, and never once like this. I did things, he said. Elias, I did things I'm not proud of. People I sold information to. Things I told myself were justified, because the man I trusted most had already shown me exactly how little loyalty was actually worth. I know. I'm going to answer for that. I know that too. Her father closed the last of the distance between them, and, for a moment that stretched longer than either of them probably expected, simply stood there, close enough to finally see each other clearly, after 25 years of distance built entirely out of a lie neither of them had told. But you're not going to answer for it alone. Not this time. Not while I'm still standing here able to say otherwise. Harper stood back by the car, watching 2 old friends finally set down 25 years of weight neither of them had ever actually been strong enough to carry alone, and felt something in her own chest loosen for the first time since a phone call had rearranged an entire evening 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. The review board hearing took place 11 days later, in a room with none of the drama the moment probably deserved: fluorescent light, government carpet, a long table of officers whose faces gave away nothing, until the exact moment the evidence made it impossible for their faces to give away anything else. Rear Admiral Osric Marsh's resignation letter had been submitted 3 days before the hearing, along with a full account, in his own hand, of an extraction order signed 25 years ago, and a panicked series of decisions made 6 months ago that had, indirectly, gotten a good man killed on a beach he'd never wanted anyone bleeding on. The board stripped his rank in a formal ceremony that lasted exactly 4 minutes, and felt, to everyone in the room, considerably longer. Elias Cormac's case moved through channels that would take considerably longer to resolve cooperation agreements. Testimony against networks he'd spent 25 years building. The specific slow machinery of a system trying to decide how much mercy a man's grief actually earned him. Harper testified on his behalf, not because she believed everything he'd done deserved forgiveness, but because she believed everything he'd done deserved context, and context, she'd learned somewhere in the last 3 weeks, was usually the only thing standing between judgment and understanding. Roan Vance was buried on a Tuesday, full honors, the specific formal grief of a military funeral that somehow managed to feel both entirely appropriate and entirely insufficient at the same time. Harper stood at the graveside between her father and Malik, Halstead a step behind them, and listened to a 21-gun salute crack across a cemetery full of headstones belonging to men who had spent their whole careers understanding exactly what Vance had understood in his last 30 seconds, that some debts get paid in a currency that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with standing your ground on a ridgeline long enough for the people you love to make it home. Afterward, when the folded flag had been handed to a sister who'd flown in from Ohio, and the crowd had mostly dispersed, Harper stayed, stood alone at the fresh grave for a long moment, the specific private ritual her father had taught her without ever quite meaning to: not the 21 guns, not the folded flag, but this. The quiet after. The part nobody films. You didn't have to hold that long, she said quiet, to a headstone that couldn't answer her. You could have called it after 10 seconds. Nobody would have blamed you. The wind moved through the cemetery. Indifferent, ordinary, the same wind that had probably moved through 1,000 other cemeteries, holding 1,000 other conversations, exactly like this one. "I'm going to keep going," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, I'm going to keep the door open the way you'd have wanted it kept open. Old hands. New hands. Both. Working together. The way you were trying to teach us before." She stopped. Let the sentence go unfinished, because some sentences didn't need finishing, and some silences were the only honest response available. Her father found her there 10 minutes later, hands in his coat pockets, standing at a respectful distance until she was ready to acknowledge him. "He'd be proud of you," Walton said, "for what it's worth. He told me that himself, the last time I saw him before all this started. Said you were the best thing to come out of everything he ever taught me." "He told you that?" "He told me a lot of things over 30 years. A small, sad smile. Mostly that I talked too much about you and not enough about anything else. Said a man who can't stop bragging about his kid probably raised her right, whether he meant to or not." Harper felt something crack behind her ribs, gentle this time. Not the sharp break of grief, but the slower give of something that had been holding too tight for too long, finally allowing itself to soften. "Dad, yeah, I'm sorry. For pushing so hard. For making you say all of it out loud on that porch when you weren't ready. Don't be." He put a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture he'd used 1,000 times across her whole life, adjusting an elbow, steadying a rifle, holding steady through every single moment that had actually mattered. "I should have said it 25 years ago. You just finally gave me the courage 25 years too late to find on my own." His grip tightened, briefly, fiercely. "That's not something to apologize for, Harper. That's the only thing in this whole mess that actually went right." They stood together at the edge of the cemetery for a long while, father and daughter, watching a groundskeeper finish smoothing the last of the fresh earth over a grave that held a man who had spent his whole life teaching people how to hold still long enough for the truth to finally catch up with them. 3 weeks later, the mess hall at Colonel's Point looked almost exactly the way it had. The night this whole story started, white linen, blue bunting, a string quartet working through the same tired rendition of the Navy hymn nobody had specifically requested. Another commendation ceremony. Different names being read this time, different ribbons being pinned. Though the room carried an undercurrent it hadn't carried 3 weeks ago. The specific hush of a base that had heard fragments of a story too classified to discuss directly, and had filled in the rest with rumor that, for once, wasn't far from the truth. Harper stood near the same bar she'd stood at 3 weeks ago, water in hand, not champagne, because some habits held steady even after everything else had changed. "You know," Halstead said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses, holding one out. "I checked. This is actually champagne this time. Figured you'd earned the real thing." She took it. "Didn't drink it yet. Careful, Chief. People might start thinking you've learned some manners. God forbid." He leaned against the bar, easier now than he'd been 3 weeks ago. Something settled in him that hadn't been settled before, the specific weight of a man who'd learned exactly how much he didn't know, and had decided to be better for it, for what it's worth. "I've been thinking about what Vance said. That first day. About the quiet ones in the corner of the room. What about it? I think I finally understand what he meant." He looked at her, steady, no swagger left in it at all. Just something plain and honest that Harper found she didn't mind nearly as much as she'd have expected 3 weeks ago. "I spent my whole career thinking loud was the same thing as strong. Watching you work these last 3 weeks taught me those aren't the same thing at all. That took you 3 weeks and one very bad first impression to figure out." "In my defense," Halstead said, "you didn't exactly correct me gently. I gave you exactly what you asked for. Fair." A small, real smile. "For what it's worth, Commander, I'd follow you into worse than a boathouse ambush. Any day you'll have me." "Careful," Harper said, though something in her chest warmed at it despite herself. "That kind of talk gets a chief a reputation. I can live with that reputation. Across the room, near the head table, a lone figure in a dress uniform, 2 sizes too formal for the occasion, stood slightly apart from the crowd. Malik, dragged reluctantly out of whatever server room she'd been hiding in for the last 3 weeks, looking deeply uncomfortable in an environment that didn't come with a keyboard. She hates this, Halstead observed. She's earned the right to hate it in a room that finally respects what she actually did. You going to go rescue her from the small talk? In a minute. Harper's eyes drifted toward the door, where a familiar figure had just stepped through silver hair, 61 years old. Dress uniform he almost never wore anymore, standing at the threshold of a room he hadn't set foot in for longer than Harper wanted to calculate. Is that my father? Something in her chest lifted, unguarded, the particular lightness of a moment she hadn't let herself hope for. He said he wasn't coming tonight. Looks like he changed his mind. Walton Kessler crossed the room the way he'd taught his daughter to cross every room that mattered, unhurried, deliberate, carrying himself like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd been hauling since before she was born. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 28 years of history, and 3 weeks of earthquake settling into something that finally felt like solid ground. Figured somebody should be here, he said, to see it properly this time. See what? He nodded toward the head table, where an aide was setting up a small podium, where Harper realized with a jolt that ran clean through her chest a set of orders sat waiting, sealed, the specific formal weight of something that hadn't been on tonight's official program 3 weeks ago. Rear Admiral Devon Castellan, who had assumed acting command of the program in the wake of Marsh's resignation, stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat, and the room went quiet in the same overlapping wave it had gone quiet 3 weeks ago. Except this time, nobody was standing in shock. This time, everybody already half knew what was coming. 3 weeks ago, Castellan said, in this same room, most of you witnessed something you weren't fully able to understand at the time. Tonight, with appropriate portions of the record now declassified, I'd like to properly recognize the officer responsible for uncovering a security failure that had gone unaddressed for 25 years, and for doing so at considerable personal and professional cost. Harper felt her father's hand find her shoulder, steady, the same grip he'd used on a porch 3 weeks ago, on a back porch a lifetime before that. Commander Harper Kessler, Castellan said, front and center. She walked to the podium the same way she'd walked across this exact room 3 weeks ago, unhurried, unbothered, the same pace she'd have used crossing a parking lot, except this time every eye in the room was already on her, and this time nobody needed a call sign to understand exactly who was standing in front of them. For actions above and beyond the call of duty, Castellan read, in the pursuit of truth over institutional convenience, and in memory of Master Chief Roan Vance, who gave his life in service of that same pursuit, it is my honor to present Commander Kessler with the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The applause that followed wasn't the polite kind. It wasn't the champagne glass, small talk kind that had filled this room 3 weeks ago either. It was something rawer than that. 300 people who had all, in one way or another, spent their careers under the specific weight of institutions that didn't always tell the truth about themselves, finding something to hold on to and watching one of their own refuse to let that weight win. Harper found her father's eyes across the room, found next to him 4 stars and 3 stars and 2 stars, standing at something that wasn't quite attention but was close enough to it, the same men who had risen from their seats 3 weeks ago, for a call sign they recognized, now standing for a truth they'd finally been allowed to hear in full. Later, much later, after the ceremony had dissolved back into ordinary conversation, after Malik had been successfully extracted from small talk, and Halstead had made good on his threat to actually enjoy himself, after the string quartet had finally, mercifully, moved on from the Navy hymn, Harper stepped out onto the same steps she'd stood on 3 weeks ago, metal still pinned to her chest. Night air off the water sharp enough to cut through wool. Her father joined her a moment later, 2 cups of coffee in hand, one of which he passed to her without asking whether she wanted it. You did good, he said. Simple. The same 2 words he'd used 1,000 times across her whole life. And somehow, tonight, heavier than they'd ever been before. "We did good," Harper said. "You, Vance, all of it. I just finished what everybody else spent 25 years starting." "That's not nothing, Harper." "No," she agreed, looking out at the black water beyond the chain link, at the same sodium lights that had watched her leave this exact spot 3 weeks ago, carrying a folder she hadn't wanted to open. "It's not nothing." Somewhere behind them, faint through the glass doors, laughter rose up from the mess hall. Halstead's probably, loud and easy in a way that had finally earned the right to be that confident again. Somewhere out past the black water, in an office with no more stars on the door, a man named Osric Marsh was beginning the long, slow work of learning to live with the truth he'd spent 25 years running from. And somewhere further still, in a facility with better security than the one Cormac had been hiding in 3 weeks ago, a man who'd once been declared dead was finally allowed to grieve his own life properly, instead of spending what remained of it as a ghost. "What happens now?" her father asked. Harper looked down at the metal on her chest, thought of a ridgeline in the fog and a hand gripping her wrist with the last of its strength, thought of a call sign that had made 4 generals stand 3 weeks ago, and a truth that had taken 25 years and 1 dead friend to finally see daylight. "Now," she said, "we keep going. Because there's always another marsh somewhere, always another silence costing more than the truth would have." She looked at her father, steady, certain. Every inch the woman he'd spent a lifetime teaching, without ever quite meaning to teach her anything at all. "And as long as I'm wearing this uniform, I intend to make sure the truth gets a fair fight." Her father smiled, the real one, the rare one, the one she'd seen maybe a dozen times in her whole life, and raised his coffee cup like it was something worth toasting. "Valkyrie," he said. "Dad, I'm allowed to be proud of my own daughter's call sign," he said, "even if she still won't tell me who picked it. That's classified. Everything with you is classified. You raised me that way." He laughed then, warm and easy, the sound carrying out over the water toward a base that had spent 3 weeks, learning exactly what kind of woman had been quietly serving in its ranks all along. And Harper Kessler stood beside her father on the steps of a mess hall, medal on her chest and a debt finally paid, and let herself, just for tonight, simply be still.